All righty. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Sensitive Podcast. I am your host, Kimball, and Somatic leadership coach for highly sensitive women, entrepreneurs, leaders, and coaches. And I am joined by Alex today, and I'm going to allow her a moment to introduce herself.
My name is Alex Schrum. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have a private practice seeing clients in Richmond, Virginia. And I can also see clients for telehealth if they live anywhere in Virginia. But I specialize in working with folks who have experienced abuse and neglect in their close relationships. And as a result of that, really struggle with a lot of shame, self-criticism, isolation, all of that.
Mm. Well, first of all, just thank you so much for your time today, Alex, and your obviously very hard-earned wisdom and expertise that you're going to share with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm really excited about the topic that we've brought today because I think that it will be, I know for me personally, it has been one of the most impactful things on my journey, which I believe it has been for you as well, which is obviously why we're discussing it. But it's been one of the most impactful things on my journey as being a highly sensitive neurodivergent person. And that is mindful self-compassion. And so I know that you use this in your clinical work extensively, and I know you use it in your own life. And I'm just wondering if you would mind explaining to us a bit what exactly that is and why you think that this work is particularly relevant for highly sensitive neurodivergent people.
Yeah. So I think I'll start off with the self-compassion piece. So really what that just means is essentially relating to yourself, in the same way that you would someone that you deeply care about. So whether that be a friend or a family member, but essentially extending the same level of compassion, grace, empathy that you normally would, no questions asked, and then turning that inward, which it seems like it would just be a natural thing for us to do, but it's really not. And for some folks, it is really, really hard and it brings up a lot. Um, so the mindful piece to mindful self-compassion is really paying attention to what distress are you currently feeling in your body? What emotions are you currently feeling in your body? Um, and then extending that compassion and empathy and understanding and grace towards yourself. So essentially it's bearing compassionate witness to yourself.
Yeah. And I know, in my work with clients, I often see that the folks who are the most compassionate towards others are the most hard on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're saying, it can be this thing where we think that it should come naturally. It should be, well, of course, I'm going to treat myself with the same care and compassion that I treat other people. But like I said, I often find that the most empathetic, the most compassionate people towards others have the most harsh self-criticism happening. And oftentimes, I'd be curious if you have this experience as well. But oftentimes, until you start to do some work together, that even that self-criticism and that really harsh inner talk, the lack of self-compassion, if you would, is something that people aren't even aware of.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And once you do become aware of it, um, it can be quite daunting. To really sit with and realize, what your normal internal landscape has become. And I think that there is definitely a grieving process that goes along with that.
And it can be very, I think you use the word daunting, and I would say that too, because it's almost like once you start to become aware of it, it's like you see how pervasive it is and just how often you're beating yourself up even over like these very tiny things, and you're like, wow, this is kind of infiltrated every fabric of the way that I am being to myself and the world, and it can sort of feel um almost insurmountable, I think, when people first start out. And that's yet another thing to give ourselves that mindful self-compassion about, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to sort of acknowledge that I'm sure that folks, as they're listening, are coming at various points of their journey with that mindful self-compassion. And there might be folks who are just starting out that really haven't done this work to recognize how pervasive that talk is. And then there might be some folks a little bit farther along where they have and they've started to replace some of that with the mindful self-compassion. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how daunting it can feel, and also to say, keep with it. It is worth it. And I know that, both Alex and myself are going to share some examples of the difference that it's made in our lives, and I think can make a huge difference. Like I said, specifically for highly sensitive neurodivergent folks. So, and just shifting with that, I would be curious if you would mind sharing a little bit of your own journey with mindful self-compassion and your own neurodivergence and high sensitivity.
Yeah. As far as the mindful self-compassion piece goes, I think what really started my journey on mindfulness truly was I was working at a nonprofit, a sexual and domestic violence program in the community. And I did that work for a really long time. And they had someone come in for the staff because I was so used to providing services to others, helping others notice their own internal worlds. And I didn't quite realize just how disconnected from my own I was. And so they had someone come in from the community and do a mindfulness-based stress reduction course with the staff. And it was amazing. Just simply noticing, like, what sensations are you even feeling in your body right now? And when does it become uncomfortable to stick with that noticing? And when do you need to perhaps come out of that to take care of yourself? And I think, so from that, I think I kind of found mindful self-compassion, the work of Kristen Neff. And I took a course through her program, which was life-changing as well. I think it's the noticing piece, because we can't make different choices or different actions if we're not aware of things,
Yeah.
So there's that, the mindfulness and the self-compassion piece. But as far as the neurodivergence and high sensitivity, I think that is kind of this like ever evolving journey I'm on right now. I recently, I think in the past couple of years, I had two different providers ask me, have you ever thought about, that you might have some neurodivergence going on? And of course, immediately I was, dismissive and like, no, I thought it was like a social media trend or fad, But when I really stepped back and allowed myself to get really honest with myself about my life experiences that other people did not know about. I knew about because I kept them hidden because of shame.
Mm.
But when I really started researching high sensitivity, in particular, it was like, oh, like this fits me pretty much to a T, actually. And I didn't know.
Oh, there's so much I could speak on within that. And yeah, I'll just take a moment to share some of my own journey with mindful self-compassion. I'd just like to share it because I think the more stories people hear, there might be an element that people can relate to in yours, and then people can relate to in mine. And I think the more stories we have like this of highly sensitive neurodivergent people, honestly, the more we can feel not alone, and the more we can realize, oh, I'm not the only one experiencing these things. And I think that is one of my primary missions in the world, because I know growing up with some of these things, I felt really alone, like really, really alone. And even well into adulthood, some of these experiences can be highly isolating. So I kind of got into mindful self-compassion, honestly, sort of at the end of many, 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 many years, decades of talk therapy. That just, it was great, and it did wonders for me. I was in therapy from the time I was 9 years old, just based on some childhood, complex trauma and things like that. And I was like this hyper aware person logically, right? Like I could tell you all of the things up here. But there was still this disconnect, like you're sharing, with actually being able to, okay, well, I can tell you what's going on up here, but what's happening below the level of the mind? Like, what sensations am I experiencing? Et cetera, et cetera. And so I actually got into somatic therapy, and have been with my same somatic therapist for about 6 years now. And then, I started my own coaching and started getting a lot of training on my own on somatics, and in the mindfulness world. And that has kind of just like opened things up for me and connecting me with myself in a way that I never experienced until I did this work. And to say that it shifted everything for me would not be an understatement. Because just as you're talking about, it really allowed me to recognize and realize what things I was experiencing. And as you named, to be able to give myself compassion for those experiences instead of judgment for those experiences. Because in the past, there would constantly be this narrative of like, you're too sensitive, you're too much, like, you're being a burden to other people. And growing up, my experiences as a neurodivergent, highly sensitive person, in the time when I grew up, I'll date myself, I was born in 83. Like there was so much less understanding around any of this. And my parents did the best they could with my sensitivities and all that I had going on. But I was misdiagnosed from a very early age, as normally happens to women who are neurodivergent. And there were just no resources for me. And so the constant narrative coming my way was, you're too much and you need to change because you're bothering all of us with your sensitivities, right? As it's not that those things were said explicitly, but that was the message that I received. And so this mindful self-compassion really changed those decades worth of experiences of internalizing, as you said, this shame for being wired in a way that I couldn't help and still can't help, right? So yeah, just wanted to share that as well. And I think that's a perfect place to sort of dive into also, as Why do you think that there's so much shame and stigma around being neurodivergent in our society? I think that's important for us to discuss.
I think that as a society, and as a culture, we're very uncomfortable with difference. And I think what ends up happening is labeling and placing value judgments on difference. So, sameness, we can understand, our brains work with that. Okay, good. Difference, we get confused, we don't understand, bad. We want to label things, make things easy, categorize things. Um, and I think, I was thinking about this actually last night as well. I think that there is an element of, I think we are a very emotion phobic society in general. And for folks who have a certain depth of emotional processing, for folks who are very moved by the suffering of others, animals, movies, songs, whatever, books, we feel very different because there isn't really an acceptance of talking about emotions, displaying emotions, even though we all have them. It's like there's been this kind of cutoff of valuing, stoicism, logic, rationale above all else. When we need both, we're comprised of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of emotions, I found myself getting emotional and tearing up a little as you were sharing that. And, you know, I couldn't help but be thinking about oppressive systems as you were sharing what you were sharing, such as, just to name capitalism, patriarchy, things of that nature. That the very design is to, like, if you're a good worker bee, then you got to fit within this mold of this is your productivity output of 9 to 5 and this many cogs in the wheel and yada yada yada. And of course, like, men more valuable than women, all these things, right? All of these oppressive systems that seek to they only value one thing. And this really reminds me, we sort of touched on this in episode 1 of my podcast that was talking about burnout with high sensitivity, and really talking about how, like, people who are highly sensitive have different gifts to offer. For example, I'm just talking about the workplace here, obviously in many different areas, but if we could learn to value the different gifts that highly sensitive or neurodivergent people bring to the workplace and honor those, instead of trying to make them be, they're a square peg and they will fit in that round hole, and therefore burning us out. And you're also not receiving the value from the unique gifts and skill sets that we have, because you're forcing us to work in such a way that doesn't even allow those gifts to come forth. So yes, not valuing the difference, a lot of like, oh, well, we would prefer you to have surface level conversations and be more surface than have this depth that makes us really uncomfortable, because we're very uncomfortable with our emotions. And I just kind of laugh at the profession that I have chosen, because I'm like, look, I'm not good at small talk, so I just like to be able to dive in with people. I chose something where I can sort of dive in, and that is valued, right? And that is a skill set that I can sort of bring to this. So I think such a thread that I'm noticing in these conversations with multiple highly sensitive people that I want to bring forward is this: we need to start to learn to value the difference. We need to start to learn to value the natural gifts and skills and abilities that highly sensitive and neurodivergent people bring to the table instead of trying to fit them into the mold of the rest of the 80% of the population.
I mean, and I think that, yes, so trying to force people to fit into a mold, I think definitely speaks to the shame piece.
Yeah.
Because then, the message implicit in that, which is kind of what you were sharing, which is certainly the message that I internalized was, well, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Because I can't do this the same way somebody else is doing it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right. There's something deficient. That belief really gets in there really strongly of like, there's something deficient about me.
Yeah.
Where it's just, no, it's not deficient. It's just different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not deficient. It's just different. I was letting that sort of marinate and percolate a little bit.
Yeah.
What are some other ways that you see shame manifest typically in people's lives? And again, I bring this up because I think just kind of like how people aren't really aware that so much self-criticism is running a lot of the times. I think people aren't aware that they are sort of cloaked in shame, internalized shame. And so I think being able to really bring forward like, oh, this is the way shame might be manifesting and be here that you may not necessarily be aware of. Of course, you've already named one of like, something is wrong with me that I can't do this. And in the same way, another person might be able to, but I'm curious if there is anything else that comes up.
Yeah, I think a few things. I think one would be, over functioning, whether that be in relationships or at work, but always the always striving to be what you believe you should be. And always kind of striving for that sense of perfection. But of course, always falling short because perfection doesn't exist. So it's like this, this hamster wheel, that we find ourselves on. So definitely that over functioning. I think also self-medicating with substances for sure. Wanting to kind of get be different. So chasing that high or that sense of intoxication to either feel different or be perceived differently. And I think also really struggling in relationships and intimacy. So, not sharing how you feel because perhaps, there's a belief that, well, it doesn't really matter to the other person or that it won't be taken seriously. So then there's a lot of stuffing that happens and then exploding. And then that's really not good for relationships.
Yeah. 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 Thank you for sharing that. I think that gives just a robust look at different ways that it may show up where honestly people aren't really tracking like, oh, that's actually shame when that's happening. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shifting back to self-compassion, what difficulties do you see arise initially when someone begins to practice self-compassion?
Yeah. I think something that comes up for people is to push against it in a variety of ways. So that might come up as oh, I'm, being selfish, or oh, I'm being self-indulgent, or oh, I'm engaging in self-pity. So there's that piece. It can feel inauthentic or awkward to people when they're first starting, when they're doing something new. um, which happens when we're learning new things or trying new things. It doesn't come naturally. Um, and then I think the other big thing that comes up a lot is that grief process of, okay, I'm now relating to myself in a kind, compassionate way, um, and acknowledging, the length of time that has gone by where perhaps I haven't done that, and perhaps I've been quite cruel to myself. Um, and then there's some grief that comes up too, as far as, you know, hmm, have I had people in my life who have related to me from a place of kindness and compassion, um, that I could internalize? Yeah, I think, working through that grief, um, is a big, big part of things. I think, and actually, particularly in the work that I do, with folks who have experienced abuse or neglect in their close relationships, so whether that be through their family of origin or intimate partners, a lot of times that treatment can get internalized. Um, and so you can start to believe those cruel things that loved ones have said about you. So that grieving process, acknowledging that pain and working through that, is really, really important.
Yeah. Hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. The difficulties that I see arise, I think there's a lot of similarities between what I heard you name in the therapy world and what I see in coaching. But there's a little bit of a difference that I wanted to share. And I think obviously, hopefully that difference is because therapy and coaching should be different. And there is a different scope, right? Just want to emphasize that. And I think that's really, really important. Um, but the thing that I see folks say, like the resistance that I see come up is like, well, if I extend myself that self-compassion, it means I won't ever reach my goals. It means that I will never, like, people are used to using the shame and the criticism in order to help. They think that it helps them achieve. It's like, if I am only like flogging myself with a stick, am I going to be able to reach these things? It feels like when they sort of let up on that, well, I'm never going to be who I should be. I'm never going to reach the goals that I have set out for myself. And that can be a really hard thing to shift. So I also wanted to name that because it was a very similar flavor to what you shared, but it was a bit different.
For sure, for sure. And I can definitely see how that would come up. I think it probably I think that probably does come up, but I think, like you were saying, maybe in a little bit of a different way. But sure, that sense of like, well, how am I gonna motivate myself to improve or make changes if I'm not critical of myself? Um, yeah. Um, and the thing is, I think it's important to respect that as well, because it's like, okay, that has worked for you
Yeah.
in a way. Um, it has motivated you to get to this point in your life. And now you're seeing that it doesn't just, it's not just partitioned off to like work or professional or academic achievement, that it's actually much more pervasive. So it's like that whole thing about like, multiple things can be true, that sure, it does work for you in a way, but there's also a cost.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that is so important because I think when we don't acknowledge the fact that it is working in some way, it can feel a bit like we're gaslighting ourselves. It's like, well, I've gotten this far using this. I've come pretty far, and that feels like a really important acknowledgement and peace. And I'm curious, what other ways that, of course, we just named one, but what are some other ways to work with the difficulties that you see arise when you first start to practice this, especially if it's difficult to imagine receiving that kindness from yourself?
Yeah, so this is a really big one. Um, and what I'll do with people is do an installation of a kind, nurturing inner figure. So, and that's an exercise from a resourcing exercise from EMDR, but I use it with this too because it can be so helpful. It changes something. So if it's difficult to imagine, receiving compassion from yourself, if it feels like this feels fake or inauthentic, okay. So then I'll ask people to or to think of anyone that they've come across throughout the course of their lives who has been kind to them, um, who has been supportive, who has been gentle with them and showed them empathy and compassion. And can they kind of conjure an image of that person in their mind and perhaps imagine the compassion coming from this person instead? And for some reason, that seems to make a huge shift.
Yeah.
And then just the other thing I want to say with that is because I'm imagining, because I've had clients say this to me, well, I can't think of anybody in my life who has, been kind to me or, extended me grace or kind or support, and then we can get creative with it and think about, okay, well, what about characters from a movie that really resonated with you, that you felt like they were very kind or nurturing? Characters from a TV show or a book, or even kind of like a completely made up person with traits that you would want to receive kindness and grace from them. I've even had people use, animals
Yeah.
as well. So, there's a lot of ways that you can work with it and meet people just where they are.
Yeah. I've even used nature with folks as well. For that,
I've
like
never thought of that.
imagining like I have a tree and a creek that I go to here in Richmond that just feels really nurturing to me. So like imagining being there and receiving the kindness from that, like different things resonate with different people. This reminds me a lot of resourcing within somatic experiencing is very similar. Wow, I love that. I love all those examples you gave.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what I would love for us to end on before we go into sort of the rapid fire questions that I have at the end for everybody is just what are the shifts and changes that you see in highly sensitive neurodivergent folks when they reach a place of more mindful self-compassion? So we sort of talked about, like a lot of times we're not aware that there's all of this internal criticism or all of this shame happening. And sometimes I think too, when people can sort of be unaware of that there are some positive shifts and changes happening. So I would love to highlight those as well of, okay, like when I start to notice this, however small, this means that I'm starting to be a bit more self-compassionate to myself.
Yeah, for sure. So I think a couple things come to mind. One is beginning to let themselves have their emotional experiences without attaching judgment to it, without placing a value judgment on it of like, well, it doesn't make sense that I feel this way, or I shouldn't feel this way. So letting it happen without like cutting it off. And then the other which is a piece of mindful self-compassion, is acknowledging the common humanity in their experience of like, okay, I'm feeling this way. It makes sense that I feel this way. Anyone else in my position would likely feel this way. So, and then that third piece of mindful self-compassion of then turning towards themselves and asking themselves, what would help me right now? What do I need right now? And then doing that thing, actually following through on it. Yeah, so those pieces, which can feel small, but are actually really, really powerful.
Yeah, I love that you acknowledge that it can feel small, because I think when you hear them, it does. And yet when you experience that, I think it feels like the hugest thing in the world. When you actually experience those shifts, and what I would say is you're shifting the way that you're relating to yourself, and your relationship with yourself colors every other relationship that you have and the way that you interact with the world. And when that shifts, to me, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses that have a different color tint, and you're seeing the entire world in a different way. It's that powerful. So like I said, I love that you acknowledge that it may sound small. And I always tell all of my clients, and I'm sure you tell your patients the same, of this may seem small when you're doing this, and it's huge. It's huge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because like you said, you're fundamentally changing what has become automatic. And that's the mindfulness piece.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if it's okay with you, I would love to shift into some rapid fire questions that I always like to just ask at the end of these podcasts, in order to help my audience and whoever's listening just get to know you a little bit better. And for us to wrap things up, I think that they can be fun. But the first question is just, is there anything that you'd like to say in closing that feels like it needs another moment to wrap up the podcast today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can emphasize enough how important and transformative self-acceptance and self-compassion really is. Because I think, anyone who is struggling with mental health or substance use, or, feeling different because of their experiences with neurodivergence, I mean, inevitably there's so much shame that comes up. And if you can get to a point where you can start to, like I said, fundamentally shift that, I mean, it's a quality of life changer. I think.
Yeah, I agree. Cosign. 100%. This has like rapidly become my favorite question that I ask, because the answers that I get are so rich. But what do you wish people knew about your experience as a highly sensitive neurodivergent person?
That we're doing the best we can. And that we're doing the best we can, and life, the way our society is set up, the way life is set up, expectations we have, can feel incredibly overwhelming to folks who are highly sensitive. Um, and so I think, you know, extending that, well, grace and compassion, that people are different and have different needs, have different capacities, and can that be okay?
Well, I got emotional again with that. I love it so much. What is the last thing that truly surprised you?
The last thing that truly surprised me. Good. This is kind of a deep answer, but I think, and I think this kind of speaks to my own journey with high sensitivity and neurodivergence and shame and all of that, is I think it's surprising to me when people that I'm close to genuinely care, if they have done something that is upsetting me or has hurt me, and that they want to talk about it and that they want to make repairs. That is still something that I'm working through, that's kind of an automatic expectation of mine. So when I receive that from people, it's kind of like, oh, wait a minute. What? Wasn't expecting this.
That's a beautiful surprise. I love that. All right, last question. What consistently brings you deep joy?
What consistently brings me deep joy is spending time with my dog and my cat. Um, I love them so much. They make me laugh. And yeah, it's like no matter what's been going on in my world, outside of my home, um, they're always there. And it's yeah, being with them, playing with them, without fail.
Mm. And it almost hits me as like animals can bring us so much mindful self-compassion as well.
Yes.
Of like if we're not used to receiving that from other people, just like we were talking about receiving it from nature or, a character or imagined person, like can also practice receiving that from animals.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. And again, just for sharing your wisdom and expertise. I know that there is so much in here that everyone is going to benefit from. So thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.